Welcome back to the Self-Indulgent Podcast. I am your host, Mariah, and today we are talking about perfectionism. I think it's actually a really good time to talk about perfectionism because it's fall time, it's winter time coming, holiday season, right? The new year is coming, and we definitely, I think, put a lot of pressure on ourselves during this time. And because we put a lot of pressure on ourselves during this time, and so perfectionism really comes from these really high, pretty borderline unrealistic expectations for ourselves. And so I've definitely struggled with perfectionism, and it actually has really adaptive and maladaptive ways of affecting us. So it can work to an extent, but then would it really be perfectionism if it's not working 100% all the time? But I do think that having some sort of want to high achieve, that's okay. But perfectionism as a personality and character trait over time, depending on how you identify with it and kind of your relationship with it, is going to determine if it's worth or helpful to you and or healthy for your mental health. So according to Psychology Today, there's actually 3 domains for perfectionism, which is interesting because I've never heard of different types of perfectionism. So when I think of perfectionism, I think of the self-oriented perfectionism. That's the first domain, and the way that perfectionism can manifest. It's imposing unrealistic desire to be perfect on oneself. The next 2 make a lot of sense to me too. You can be more than one. I think it can be a mixture, a spectrum. It really depends. So the next one is other-oriented perfectionism, which means imposing unrealistic standards of perfectionism on others. And then you have socially prescribed perfectionism, which involves perceiving unrealistic expectations of perfection from others. So that one's really interesting to me because it has to do with your perception of what you think others are putting on you, the pressure that you're receiving from others to be perfect, high achieving, to achieve these things where you should be in life, and kind of how that manifests and feels for you. And what I think is important to note about this one is that it actually reminds me a lot of social media and the effects on social media. I was actually talking to my best friend the other day, and she brought up a really great point. Shout out to Brandy. She was talking about how social media has almost made it seem like we have to accomplish certain things by our early 20s, mid 20s, late 20s, before we're 30. There are these things that we should be accomplishing as if it is the norm. So for example, making 6 figures before you're 30, or having a successful, growing business, as if that's the new norm because of what we're seeing on social media. And I think that can drive this perfectionistic, high achieving mindset in really unhealthy ways, because there's a fine line between motivation and wanting to be like somebody else and wanting somebody else's life and looking to achieve what somebody else has achieved. So I'm going to talk about kind of all of these intertwined and some of the ways that I think it affects us. For me, perfectionism has gotten in the way of a lot of things. I know that we talk about perfectionism as people usually see these as type A people, super high achieving. They want everything to be perfect. They're going to get stuff done. For me, what I've experienced actually is that amount of pressure over time as I've gotten older has caused me to not do anything. not to do anything. My perfectionism got to a point where I overthink and want everything to be perfect to a point where I do nothing. I will either research something to death. I want to know everything. I don't want to look like I don't know something. I want to be at mastery level all the time. And something I've been talking about recently is how even with starting this podcast, it was really hard at first, or the ways in which I've tried to use social media in the past, because think about it when you're a kid, right? When you try new things or you want to start something new, for me anyway, I would go on deep dives, really exciting deep dives to learn everything about it and just really give it a shot and be excited to do that. And over time, I would get better at it, right? You practice makes perfect. Although I no longer am necessarily striving for perfect, but we'll get into that later. The humility is very loud when you're growing up as a kid. You're willing to make those mistakes, or you're not even really looking at them as mistakes. It's like an experiment. You're more willing to experiment just to see what's going to happen, and then you will build on that and not really think of it as a, wow, this really didn't work, or wow, this was a waste of time. That's something that I struggle with immensely is feeling like things are a waste of time. It has 100% heightened my anxiety. So now as an adult, I have less time. I feel like I don't have the time. I want to be mastery at everything immediately. That's why grad school has been really hard for me as well, because it requires more time. It requires a certain level of studying. It requires all of this different effort. And sometimes you don't always care about exactly what they're talking about. So that makes it even harder. Oh, it's almost painful, like the journey to mastering something or really learning something, digesting something. And, as we get older, it's like, I don't want to have the time. So if I can't get it on the first try, I'm gonna give up. It reminds me of perfectionism because I want to be at a level that I may have to build up first. And I'm not allowing myself to do that. I'm not allowing myself to go through growth periods because it feels like failure. It feels like, wow, why am I not getting this already? This impatience of like, I want to do something. You have this great idea, right? Like you have this passion, this great idea. And then you realize that it's going to take things that you don't know about or you have to learn more about first. And that can be really discouraging, I think, as we get older with less time, less energy, all the noise. I've been talking a lot about creativity and content creation, and I can get into this in another episode, just create the creative brain in general. We take in so much of other people's content and we're taking in so much of what others are creating, and there's so much noise, the news, all the things on social media, on TV, wherever you get your stuff from. We are drowning out our own processes, our own ways of thinking. There's so much noise. Of course, it's hard to want to start something new. Wanting to be able to do something the second you think of it and be good at it is a function of perfectionism. It's something that is actually really limiting, and we have to kind of find more humility in some of the things that we're doing. Along with that, what perfectionism has done for me over time, without having firm understandings really, and boundaries, and just checking in with myself, I've allowed it to kind of run wild. So it has created procrastination in me because it's for example, studying, right? I hate studying. I think me not liking studying actually comes from more of the idea that I can spend all these hours studying, and what if I still don't get it? What if I still fail or cannot get that A after all that studying, right? And then it becomes no more about just passing, just getting the pass so I can move on. Now it's like, I spent all this time, I need the A. I need the A. It almost creates avoidance, this avoidance of I don't want to do it. I don't want to spend all that time on it if I'm going to fail anyway. It's this all or nothing behavior that perfectionism also feeds into. Why can't we be somewhere in the middle? Why does it have to be, I don't have to spend 4 hours straight studying. There are other ways to try it. There are other ways to tackle it. And then also, it's okay to not get the A. There's that perfectionism, especially if you're comparing yourself to others. And that's actually something else. Comparing ourselves to others really makes perfectionism a almost dangerous thing when we are trying to achieve certain things. And then we start comparing ourselves to others and what others had. Like I mentioned before, the people in their 20s right now that are making 6 figures. So these people are making 6 figures and you're not in your 20s. I need to do this next year. Next year, I need to be where they are. If they can do it, I can do it, which is true to an extent, right? You should feel like I can do anything anybody else is doing. But it shouldn't come from a place of you're envious or because you saw they have it, now you have to have it. No, it has to come from a place of clear vision. That's another thing that I want to talk about. We don't check in with ourselves enough. We don't get clear on what we really want. People who are super high in perfectionism and high achieving, do you sit down and really ask yourself, why am I doing this? What am I doing this for? who am I doing this for? I think those are really important questions to ask yourself. And I think that we get really frustrated. We allow ourselves and we put these unrealistic expectations on ourselves without like a clear vision. Your vision is important because I want to make 100K in my 20s. That's not a clear vision. That's not okay. And one, how are you going to do that? Two, what do you care about? Why do you want the 100K in your 20s? I think those are really important things to get clear on. It's really hard when we have envy and we're comparing ourselves to others and we actually don't even really know what we want. Then it's like, now what am I doing? Another piece to like this avoidance and like perfectionism actually causing you to not start and wanting to be at like a mastery level versus kind of starting from the very beginning and having to go through trials and tribulations to continue to grow. It can make us not follow through, because if we never started, then we never have to say that we failed. That's another way that I think perfectionism can actually function, is like not doing anything at all, especially if you've been discouraged. And that's another way that comparisons can function. It's like you can be overwhelmed by the success of others. That's how kind of like your depression can function. You feeling like you have no control over your life and seeing all these other people doing all these other things, it can hit hard. It can be really, really hard. So something else that comes to mind that I've experienced in a perfectionism mindset, I think it creates a pattern of only being nice to yourself when you've reached perfection. For some people, this negative self-talk to do better, to do more, and it's so bad for your brain. It is so bad for your relationship with yourself. For example, you know how like if you're in the gym or you see people in the gym and they're like yelling at themselves or their coaches are yelling in their faces. That's kind of what I mean. Like, so if you're stressed and you're tired and you start telling yourself, shut up, what do you mean? You're not tired. Anybody else can do this. Look, this is why you don't have anything yet, because look at those people. They're putting this, and this into this, and you're just sitting around crying because you don't want to work anymore. You're tired for the day. That's like, like almost, it's really kind of like bullying yourself when you think about it. And then that creates an idea. You are only nice to yourself or can appreciate yourself when you reach a certain status or certain level. But then does that ever really happen? No, because you reach that and then you're like, but you can do more. Here's the next one. Like, when do you ever congratulate yourself, right? Like, when do you ever celebrate yourself for those wins, the small wins? Like, that's not happening. And that's really not good for your mental health. And honestly, it also doesn't allow you to enjoy the things that you've accomplished. So when you finally have it all, and I think this is what feeds, when they say some of the rich they're not happy, it's because you've given up and sacrificed almost your like humanity in a way, like your mind, your soul, your spirit, your love, in order to achieve these things yourself. And you feel like you have nothing. And you've accomplished it. You made it. And it's not doing anything for you. That's something that I worry about. I'm trying really hard to appreciate the journey, right? And that means high and lows. And that means I am not going to be high achieving all the time. Another way perfectionism can function is if you cannot give yourself grace, right? And you have all these expectations for yourself, and often unrealistic expectations for yourself. And this is what this other oriented perfectionism that they mentioned, you are going to treat others that way. You are going to, if you can never give grace to yourself, how are you going to be able to give it to others? I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by this, because that can be confusing, because I can see how it can work in the opposite way as well. But okay, think about conflicts at work. So say if you do something, you make a mistake or whatever. Usually people with perfectionism, they do not like being told they did something wrong, or they don't like being corrected, because if you're a perfectionist, you are checking all your boxes, you're trying to be efficient as possible, you're trying to operate in a way in which you leave no rooms for mistake. That is how you work. You take your work seriously. So when somebody comes and says, hey, you messed this up, it can bring up a lot of feelings, and it can be the smallest thing. And I think that for me, like, even I remember this in starting in even school, like middle school. Like if I got in trouble, I was one of those kids. I did not like getting in trouble by teachers. I did not like not getting A's. It bothered me. It was like an over-identification with my character. It felt like an attack on my character because I wrapped up my self-worth in what I can achieve. So let me bring it back to the work example, right? When somebody tells you something about yourself or is correcting you or you're getting feedback, it can be very hard to get feedback, even if it's constructive criticism as a perfectionist. Like it makes you uncomfortable. So you get this feedback and it eats you alive. What also happens that I've noticed is that when other people make mistakes, you're pissed. So because you're holding yourself to that standard, any little thing that somebody else does might piss you off. If somebody makes a small mistake, it can really bother you. You're putting unrealistic expectations on others. You're letting small mistakes of others bother you and just like, why aren't you doing better? And so I think that goes hand in hand with the way that you are experiencing it for yourself. So I also wanted to talk about this idea of being the best version of yourself. I want to be the best version of myself. I'm working to be the perfect version of myself, my idealized version of myself. That to me can be really harmful. Why do you ask? Mariah, this is like a wellness podcast. What do you mean? You don't want us to be the best version of yourselves? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, how come I cannot look at myself and say that this is the best version of myself today? When you really think about it, you are your best version of yourself right now. Right now, this is the best version of yourself, right? The future does not exist yet. Well, it exists, but we're not going to get into that in this episode. Never mind. But the future is not the present right now. How come we can't accept where we are and who we are now? You have to love yourself now. And this speaks to my first episode. Self-love is accepting where you are now, accepting this version of yourself and nurturing that. And with that nurturing, you will grow. You will change. We're all changing. We'll get better. And it's okay to have goals and aspirations. But if you can't accept what you're doing now and who you are now, it's going to be a very painful journey. It's just going to hurt more. And it may even lead to that feeling of like you achieved your next level up, right? For example, weight loss, right? You lose this weight, you reach the weight, and then stuff still doesn't feel right. Yeah. Because you have not loved yourself along the way. Like, this is okay for me. Like, this is the best version of myself. I think language is really important. We have to be very, very intentional about the words we use and the things and the messages we send to ourselves and others. And I think that working towards this perfect, ideal version of yourself, I think it's a slippery slope. This is the best version of myself because it's here right now. And with that acceptance and nurturance, I'm going to continue to grow. And I'm excited to see who I am 5 years from now, 10 years from now, a month from now. Perfectionism also drives a really, okay, I'm competitive. I am competitive, especially when it comes to games. It's a little unhealthy. I think it's a function of my perfectionism. I cannot express the emotion and the activation that happens in my brain when I lose. It drives me nuts. My friends have seen it, they get it, and they still love me. So I'm very appreciative of them. Thank you, because that is my ugly side. I accept it. I accept it though. It's not going anywhere. My competitive nature is here. It's in me. I just have to worry about not overly identifying with it. If I lose, does it make me want to throw up and fight? A little bit. Sure does. But I am able to move on. It has nothing to do with my self-worth. It doesn't speak to my abilities if I lose things. That is something that's super important. But I want to talk about competition, and I'm talking, that's like just in games and stuff, like that's really where it comes out. However, competitive nature against other people to be the best, to be perfect. Yes, it's a motivator. It is a driving force in doing our best, but we can't over-identify with that, right? Because it brings us right back to comparing ourselves to others when we are in our own lanes. We are our own people. We are meant to do our own things. So yes, it can be hard. Say if you're competing for a job position or you have a competing business. I think it's so dangerous to get wrapped up in that competition because you're no longer with your purpose. You're no longer thinking about your purpose. You're hindering your creativeness, right? You're hindering your unique individuality because you're not embracing it anymore. You're too focused on the competition. You're too focused on beating out. You're too focused on being the best. When really, you just need to do what's best for you. What can I do? What do I have to offer? What do I care about? Though that's where we need to focus. And that could be really, really hard, especially for perfectionism. I want to talk more about the other-oriented perfectionism and the expectations that we place on others. If you're listening to this podcast, you, I'm sure, have some level of wanting to grow, right? You have this desire to want to do better, to do something differently, to live a little differently, to connect to yourself more. That is great. It is really great. But it can be hard if we feel stagnant or we feel like, why does this still bother me? Why can't I be here yet? Why can't I be at this mental state yet? And you're doing a lot of work, and it's hard work. Like we said in episode 1, self-love is really hard work. It's not easy. It's often not fun. It can be, but it's not perfect, right? So I think inherently to practice self-love, you have to let go of perfectionism. That's just all I have. That's that on that. Like if you are actively practicing self-love, you are releasing and letting go of perfectionism. And that's the truth. You cannot fully embrace self-love while holding yourself to a perfect standard. Not possible. They're opposites. So that's my thoughts on it. Now, with that being said, when you're on a journey of self-growth and you're doing all these things, it's really easy to place expectations on others to want to grow, to want to change mindsets. When you can get really excited, the more you learn about yourself, the more you grow, and you want to bring others along that journey. And then we forget that that other people have different lives. Other people have lived differently. They've experienced things differently. They're on their own journey, is my point. It can become very easy to try to, especially your people you're close to place expectations on them unconsciously, even, especially if you've gone through some growth, some changes, some awakenings, right? Some epiphanies. You want to share those things. It can be very easy to place certain expectations on other people who are not on your journey. So that's just something else to keep in mind. Now let's talk about some things we can do to fight back perfectionism. It can be important to ask yourself, and again, we're getting into self-reflections because I love them. And how are you going to grow if you're not checking in with yourself? You can't. It's not going to happen. First, I think it's important to ask yourself, take your best friend, right? Or a close family member, somebody you love dearly, right? Somebody who can do no wrong in your eyes. Like you just love this person. You think they're great. They are the bee's knees. You love them, right? If you are struggling with giving yourself grace and allowing yourself to not be perfect, would I expect this of my friend to operate in this way, to have to, this unrealistic expectation, would I place it on somebody else? Would I talk to them like that? If the answer is no, actually, I'm telling you, that's the answer is. The answer is no. Now, if you have the others-oriented perfectionism, you might hold them to a really high expectation, but I think it's just important to find a way to practice grace, right? I think for me, I definitely give my friends more grace than I give myself, and that's something that I'm working on. I think it's something that's really important. Another way to that we can start working against perfectionism is to kind of try to adapt this mindset of just because we're adults now does not mean that we cannot experience ourselves as learning and growing. I think that's where the disconnect happens from childhood and adolescence. We go from exploring, knowing that this time is for figuring it out, knowing that we're learning growing constantly. They were hitting these big milestones. It's expected to be learning and growing and to experience ourselves in that way, and to not necessarily hold ourselves to needing to have already accomplished so much. There are some people who do during childhood, and those people are more likely to, suffer from perfectionism in a maladaptive way as they get older, because that kind of just continues. So it's important to balance your self-love and self-care practice with high achieving perfectionism, because it's not always maladaptive. We've just talked about some ways in which it can become maladaptive. But I think if you can balance checking in with yourself and being kind to yourself, I think perfectionism can work in some ways. A high achieving type A personality, I think if there can still be a balance. It's just really important to say, hey, just because I'm an adult now doesn't mean that I'm not learning, experiencing, and growing. I think another thing to keep in mind is it's okay to be a beginner. It is okay to not know nothing about something you're interested in. It doesn't mean it's not for you just because you don't already know it. It wasn't something you were interested in a month ago. That doesn't matter. If it's something you care about, you're interested in now, go for it. We have to just do it. It's so crazy. I know it. I get it. Nike, I understand. Over all these years, hearing the just do it. It's hit different as I've gotten older in different ways. And it is important to just do it. I decided to do this podcast. I made the decision in the beginning of August, and I filmed my first 2 episodes very shortly after. I waited until October 3rd to launch, but just to make sure that this was something that I did want to commit to, which is, I think, a good balance, right? But I did just do it. I did wake up one day and say, all right, I think I'm going to do it. And that was the most freeing and authentic version of myself in that moment, where I really just all right, I'm just going to do it. People have been telling me to do this for years. I just, no, not for me. I think I doubted myself. I was like, I have to learn all these things about it. I don't know anything about how to podcast or what podcasting looks like. Over the summer, I meditated a lot more. I started my journaling practice. I was determined this summer to get closer to myself. And in doing that, it allowed me the space and opportunity to just say, why not? Just do it. Just give it a shot. It's really important to practice this humility. It's okay. This isn't going to be perfect. I'm going to make mistakes, right? I have to try new things. For example, today is my first time doing this without me having written out a full script. If you listen this far and it felt like it was a little all over the place, that's why, but I had to give it a shot, right? With my life and my time and all the things, I'm not always going to be able to write out a full script, where I've thought through beforehand extensively and written it all down and organized it in a way to present it. So now I have to practice a new skill of just kind of giving myself an outline and going on the fly. And that's a skill that I want to learn. And it's going to just something that I'm going to have to do over time and pray for the best and that I get better at. And I just did it. I had every intention this week to still write out that episode until it got to yesterday night. Oh man, I still didn't write out that episode. Well, I have an outline with jotted stuff down. I'm just going to do it. We're just going to do it. And so I think it's just important to realize that, to think about it like that, to just start, just do things and learn along the way, right? You've done enough research. You've thought about things to death, your ideas, your hopes, and then you're just watching other people do things. Just do it. Don't let your perfectionism not let you start. Don't let it make you avoid doing things. Another way to help get over perfectionism is to get in the habit of creating more achievable goals. Baby steps. That's really what we're saying here. This speaks to that wanting to be at mastery level, right? It's okay to be a beginner. So in order to start doing that and to just do it, small goals, small little goals. So for me, a goal was pick a launch date and film 2 episodes before the launch date. That was a very achievable goal. What happens with people who are super high achieving and have these really high expectations for themselves, they only think about the big picture. They only think about the end goal. And that's extremely overwhelming, and that creates an extreme amount of pressure, right? It's okay to be aware of your end goal and to see your vision clearly. That's important. Where you want to go is very important, but that can't be the only thing you think about. You have to be able to break things down. Otherwise, we get really caught up, and when we start and we don't see us near where we want to end up, that's very discouraging. And if that's all you're thinking about, you're not going to continue. I also think small goals are important because you're getting that gratification and that I accomplished it in smaller doses over time versus waiting for this really big rush of just, I did it. I'm this big end goal, right? And then it's over. You want to pace yourself, right? Make this small goal. Oh my God, I hit the goal. Celebrate it. Celebrate the small wins. That's so important. You've achieved something really great. The small wins, if you can acknowledge those, I think it can foster an appreciation for yourself and just giving yourself time to realize, hey, look at me go. It gives you a chance to celebrate yourself, right? And that will, that's nurturing and accepting where you are now. That's self-love. Another one. This is something that I'm getting better at, actually. I will give myself that win. I'm getting better at this. Is accepting criticism. You want to challenge your perfectionism and you're high achieving? Work on accepting criticism. It can be hard depending on where the criticism is coming from. Don't get me wrong. If you can start to accept criticism, you've kind of began to de-identify with the mistakes or the areas that need improvement or work, right? Your more vulnerable side. It helps you de-identify with it so strongly, right? Oh, okay, you're right. Maybe I did do that a little off. Maybe that could have been better. Let's think about it more. How can I adapt this? How can I, that's great. That's growth at the end of the day. And it's not to say you have to listen to everything everybody says, but to be able to just sit with it and take it in and just say, hey, okay, well, this is what I'm going to take and this is what I'm not. And I think it just separates yourself from your ego. And it also will help you from doing this whole them versus me thing. There's been many times where I'm I did all this. I put so much work into this. I tried so hard. I spent so much blood, sweat, and tears on this. And you're saying that there was a problem? You have not even listening to what the critique is, because it feels like an attack on me. And that's what happens when you're high achieving and you care about things and you're efficient and you try really hard, right? You identify with that hard ass work. You identify with that. And then it's a part of you. It's a part of who you are. And it feels like they just attacked who you are. And that's valid. That is so valid. But it also, it hurts. It sucks to feel like that. So we want to be able to work towards accepting some of that criticism. And it's not saying you have to change or do exactly what the person said, but it's just being able to receive it, right? Just being able to sit with it so that you don't feel like your being was attacked. That's quite literally what it feels like. It feels like they just attacked your spirit. It's really how it feels. I don't know if anybody else understands what I'm saying or gone through, but that's really how it feels. So my next one, I kind of touched on a little bit earlier with getting your vision, your purpose and stuff like that, but focus on meaning over perfection. So what do I mean by this? When I was making this podcast, right, it was really important to me to connect with people. I really wanted to cultivate a community where people are able to look at themselves in a new way, to connect with themselves in a new way, and to love themselves. That was so important to me. It was so much more important than it being perfect. And that ultimately led to that just do it mindset. I felt so connected to the purpose of the podcast that ideas were flowing. It was crazy, honestly. I don't think I've experienced with anything I've created thus far, really. It felt right. It had meaning. I stood 10 toes behind it. I believe in it. That allowed for me to just do it. That allowed for me to say, I'm gonna just figure it out on the way. I want to get this out there. I want to talk. I'm ready to talk. I'm I'm ready to speak to people. So that's what I mean by focusing on the meaning versus the perfectionism. Because do I want things to be perfect? Yes. If you're watching this right now versus listening, do I want to be filming in the space that I'm filming with right now? No. Does it drive me crazy a little bit? Yes. I would love a bougie area to be able to film this podcast in. But that's not the purpose of the podcast. It's not for me to be in a cute, really nice, bougie place and film this. That's not the purpose of it. So I let that go. I'm cool. I'm happy to be doing this in the first place. So that's an example of putting meaning, purpose, value over perfectionism. That's everything I have right now on how to start moving, de-identifying, I guess, with perfectionism. But before we end the episode, I do have my reflection questions. I always do. I hope you're doing them, at least thinking about it if you're not going to write it down. I want you to list some things. Ask yourself, what is currently holding me back from doing some of the things that I want to do? And I want you to see if any of those reasons kind of line up with some of the stuff we talked about today. And then I want you to imagine something that you really want. I want you to get very clear on what you want, that vision, what it looks like, what it feels like, very clear on the vision. And then I want you to think of an extremely small baby step. Actually, I want you to think of 5 small baby steps. And then I want you to ask yourself, can I commit to making the first step? And if the answer is no, you should reflect more on why. And if the answer is yes, you should just do it. And ask yourself, how has perfectionism shown up in your life based on the ways we've described it, in this episode? What is one step that you'd like to take to work on that perfectionism? As always, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I cannot believe that this is the 4th episode. I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a lot to me. I'm very excited about where this is going to go. Your feedback so far has been really amazing. I really appreciate the conversations that I've had with some of you who have listened. Please, please, please download the episode. Don't forget to rate wherever you watch it from. We are now on iHeartRadio, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music. I'm sure I'm forgetting some, but we are everywhere. So please comment, like the episode, download the episode. It helps more than you know. Follow us on Instagram at Self-Indulgent Podcast, and on YouTube, subscribe at The Self-Indulgent Podcast. And I cannot wait until next week. Thank you and have a blessed and intentional week.